Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this second day for this intriguing conference. So I will just start the first session of the day. We got 5 speakers, and each of them have approximately 15 minutes, and they are asked to save 1 or 2 minutes for questions, but I'm sure there will be room for questions. So without hesitation, I will leave the floor to James Pawelski, University of Pennsylvania. Please, James.
Thank you so much, Stefano. And thank you to Pierluigi and Riccardo and everyone who had anything to do with this meeting, which is such a delight. I just keep having fantastic conversations and connections, and to think that this is just the beginning. It's really exciting to think about where we will go together. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, fantastic. All right, so I would like to share with you some perspectives from the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project. I see this conference as kind of like a potluck, where we each bring a dish and we add it to what everybody else brings, and we have a wonderful meal out of it. And so I'm bringing my potluck, my dish, to the potluck. If you'd like to sample it, great. And if you don't mind me sampling your dishes, I will definitely do that. So I just wanted to share with you some of the things that we've been doing over the last 10 or 15 years to add to the communal dinner. So the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project is located at the Positive Psychology Center in the University of Pennsylvania. That's where I have been for almost 20 years. I'm a philosopher by training and have been working in the field of psychology, and particularly positive psychology. In 2014, we got our first grant with the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, because I, in my time with positive psychology, was excited to be involved in the field and to see the advances in psychology, but I was also puzzled because there weren't more people like me. So that is to say, from the humanities, from the arts involved. And so the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project is really a way of opening up the discussion, opening up the table for others to sit and to talk specifically around questions of human flourishing. So our work in the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project involves theory, research, and practice. So at the level of theory, we're developing approaches, concepts, and definitions, creating a growing network of 150 leading scholars, researchers, and practitioners, publishing foundational books and articles, which I'll describe, give an overview of in a moment. We're also involved in basic scientific research. This involves developing a conceptual model and instruments for investigating the well-being effects of engagement with arts and humanities, and identifying and investigating relevant mechanisms. How is it that engagement in arts and culture can lead to a variety of outcomes in human flourishing? We've also been designated as a U.S. National Endowment for the Arts Research Lab since 2020. All of this work we believe is important, and it's aimed toward application. And so the dissemination and implementation of this work. So we're working with cultural organizations, schools, universities, and governments to optimize the well-being effects of arts and humanities. So where was the direction that we were supposed to point? Oh, there we go. Okay, great, thank you. So positive psychology, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the field of positive psychology? Okay, some of you are, great. So it's about 25 years old. It's the scientific study of what makes individuals and communities thrive. Certainly a part of this is focused on ameliorating problems, but for the most part, positive psychology says, the mainstream psychology had really been focused on that task of curing or at least treating mental illness, and positive psychology points out that well-being goes beyond merely the amelioration of disease to the kinds of things that we want. What are our strengths? What are the ways in which we connect as human beings? What is it that makes individuals and communities thrive? Positive psychology is part of a catalyst of what I like to call the eudaimonic turn, eudaimonia from the Greek well-being, flourishing, an explicit focus on human flourishing as a core interest and goal. And so positive psychology has now influenced a number of domains, including psychiatry and economics and political science and government, neuroscience, medicine and public health, education, and business, to name some of them. So positive psychology focuses on the science of human flourishing. Because I come from philosophy, I'm particularly interested in arts and culture. And so the work that we're doing in the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project then adds this piece of arts and culture. So we're kind of at the nexus of science and well-being and arts and culture. And we like to call our work the positive humanities. And when I use the term positive humanities, I mean that in a way that embraces the arts as well. So a definition of the positive humanities, a new field of academic scholarship, scientific research, and creative practice concerned with the relationship between culture and human flourishing. So if you think about these words, culture and flourishing, they're botanical metaphors. And the word culture comes from the Latin cultura, which means to cultivate, like to cultivate a field. And when that process is successful, it results in the flourishing of the plants. So too, I believe that human culture is a process which, when it's successful, should result in individual and collective human flourishing. A little more detailed definition of the field, because this is, an academic conference, so I can share this a little more. I can geek out a little bit on the more detailed definition. The interdisciplinary, multi-industry, and cross-sector examination and optimization of the relationship between the experience, creation, and study of human culture, and the understanding, assessment, and cultivation of human flourishing. Let's break that down into parts. So interdisciplinary, multi-industry, and cross-sector. Human flourishing is such a broad topic and is so important that no one individual or no one perspective or approach could possibly give us what we need. So one of the exciting things, I think, about human flourishing is that it is an invitation to everyone to take part. So interdisciplinary, across disciplines in arts and culture, but also across disciplines in the sciences, including the social sciences and the natural sciences. Multi-industry, so we have these creative industries of music and art and film. And so these creative industries, which are guided oftentimes by profit, it's important to include them as well. And finally, the cross-sector, so the nonprofit domain, the museums and the concert halls, performing arts centers, and so on. All of us need to be working together in this process. It's the examination and optimization. I don't believe that arts and culture, as they currently are experienced in our world, have fulfilled their possibility with regard to human flourishing. I think this requires an understanding. I think it also requires a shift, a change, a growth, a transformation of our engagement with arts and culture to fully realize what they can contribute to human flourishing. The experience, creation, and study of human culture. Oftentimes we split those apart, don't we? So at the university, we study human culture. It's at the concerts and perhaps the museums where there's the experiencing of it. And then the makers kind of go off and do their magic and then share with us what they've done. And I think that we really need to have more of an integration. Those of us who study culture really need to be involved in the creation, or at least in the interaction with the creators, and certainly to experience it as well. The danger is to become so busy studying culture that we forget to engage in it. That would be indeed an ironic tragedy. And then finally, the understanding, assessment, and cultivation of human flourishing. So certainly trying to understand what this domain means, what the ramifications are, but then also finding ways of assessing in ways that are appropriate. Oftentimes, the assessment of culture happens in terms of, in economic terms. What are the economic implications, both in terms of the budget of the art museum, let's say, but also in terms of the economic impact? Those assessments are not unimportant, but they're not sufficient, because we don't have art in order to make money. We have art for something different, and I like to call that the eudaimonic value. And so the work that we're engaged in is to try to say, can we find ways of assessing engagement with arts and culture that are more central to the aesthetic experience of it? So can we find ways of assessing, of measuring the effects on empathy, or the effects on social connection, or the effects on personal transformation or transportation, the notion of flow, the engagement that can come from this. And then, of course, the cultivation. So it's not enough just to have culture. There needs to be this interactive relationship with it. So one of the things that we've done in our work is to bring together groups of scholars across 8 different disciplines in arts and culture. Again, the temptation in academia is to sit in your own office and imagine how the world is or imagine how the world should be, create models that allow you not to get too confused by the complexity of the real world. These models are much easier to work with. When you involve human beings, things can get messy, people can disagree with you, et cetera, et cetera. And that's exactly what we need, we believe, in this domain. So it's not sufficient for social scientists to sit in their offices and think about how the world should go. We need to have collaboration. So we brought together groups of scholars in philosophy, history, religious studies and theology, literary studies, art, music, theater, and film. And we asked them, what can your discipline contribute to the conceptualization and cultivation of human flourishing? The historians, for example, we had historians there from Harvard, from Penn, from Dartmouth, and we asked them, what is the value of history for life? And they said to us, what a great question. Nobody asks us that question because we're involved in, 19th century British history, and we don't have time to think about the value of history for life. And they loved that we asked them that question, and they really engaged with that. And it was a meaningful process. So now each of those groups, each of the participants has contributed a chapter. We're now in the process of publishing a volume in each of these disciplines in a book series with Oxford University Press. Already out is the book on philosophy and human flourishing, history, literary studies, music, cinema and media, and theater. In press are volumes on the visual arts and human flourishing and religious studies, theology, and human flourishing. We have also already published a few volumes. The Eudaimonic Turn, Wellbeing and Literary Studies. On Human Flourishing is a poetry compendium. And then Happy Together, a book that I co-wrote with my wife that applies positive psychology and the positive humanities to romantic relationships. And then finally, just over a year ago, we published the Oxford Handbook of the Positive Humanities. This is more oriented towards social science, social scientists, and so there are almost 40 chapters exploring different themes, looking at the connection between empirical research and the positive humanities. This is our conceptual model that we have developed. You should be grateful that you're not my student because there will be no exam on this after the session. I'm not going to go through this in detail. I just want to show you some of the complexity. So on the left-hand column, we have the arts and humanities engagement. And in the middle column, we have the mechanisms that we have identified as being important pathways for a whole range of outcomes of human flourishing. Someone mentioned yesterday that culture can be good or bad. And we fully agree with that. It's not just that, oh, you read some novels and you'll be a great person. We need to understand with as much nuance as we possibly can the conditions under which engagement in the humanities of various sorts lead to various outcomes. So the mechanisms, that central column, are things that we've focused on particularly because we believe that it's really crucial to understand more of the nuances of these pathways between engagement in arts and culture and human flourishing. So reflection is where you are empowered to intentionally reinforce habits, values, and worldviews and transform maladaptive ones. The unexamined life is not worth living, a European said a few millennia ago. Acquisition, you have experiences that result in enduring insight, skills, or habits, for example, having mastery experiences. Immersion, your attention is fully captured by the immediacy of the experience. You disconnect from the worries of everyday life. You feel carried away. We believe that this immersion is probably a gateway because if you're not focused, you're not paying attention to something, it's less likely to have an impact on you. Socialization, you're able to understand more clearly who you are and what roles you play in your community and culture. And then finally, expression. You're able to externalize your thoughts and feelings, whether in solitude or with others. And we call these the RAISE mechanisms. We have a toolkit of measures that we've developed to assess the presence of these. So finally, I just want to share with you some selected current areas of research and practice. So on the empirical side, we are focused on empirical research on optimizing the well-being effects of engagement with visual art. Creating measurement instruments. How do we know what happens, not just, again, academically, but psychologically in terms of our interactions with others as well. We're developing and testing techniques for intentionally cultivating empathy and belonging. We're working with museum visitors as well as visitors to a virtual research platform we have co-developed. It was our way of coping with COVID. Since we couldn't do museum research, we co-developed a virtual platform for this work. We're also engaged in empirical research on optimizing the well-being effects of engagement with music. We're at the beginning of this process, both face-to-face concert attendance and listening to music streaming services. We are also engaging in empirical research on how arts and culture contribute to the flourishing of Black individuals and communities in the United States. One of the key aspects, of course, of culture is for whom, by whom, whose story is it, who has access, who doesn't, and so this is part of our work there. On the application side, we're working with the OECD and UNICEF and others to establish human flourishing as an explicit aim of education. So it's not enough to think of education as vocational preparation, but how can we include approaches to arts and culture within education to have flourishing be an aim of education. We're sharing our work in community anti-threat team trainings aimed at reducing mass violence, creating a network of arts practitioners to work with at-risk individuals, working with the Philadelphia office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. One of the things that can happen when you get isolated, isolated from the group, you have a grievance, and that can turn to loneliness, and in extreme cases, that can then turn to very dark places. And so individuals sometimes seek out culture that's very negative, certain kinds of music, certain kinds of manifestos written by others who've perpetrated mass violence, and that can lead to horrific consequences. So we're working with the FBI to say, what about understanding the needs and interests of these individuals from the standpoint of arts and culture? How can we help them to reconnect with things that can help them move in positive directions? We're working right now on a case of someone who's been incarcerated for having made threats and is now out, but we're concerned that there may be a continuation of this trajectory. So we're working to connect that person. This person is really interested in music. So connect that person with a musician who can both help them with the music and with the mentoring. Finally, cultivating more flourishing cities. We're establishing local networks of researchers and arts organizations for collaboration and shared programming on well-being. We're finding enormous interest from cultural organizations on these topics of well-being. It's something they're very much interested in, and yet they feel like they don't really have the knowledge for how to implement that in their programming. Final slide, if you're interested in finding out more about our work, we have a newsletter and a colloquium series. You're welcome to join for free. More at humanitiesandhumanflourishing.org. My email address is there, thanks to my core team, one member of which, Catherine Cotter, is here today. Catherine waved, everybody. Catherine is here. She'll be part of the final panel later on. She is our director of research and spearheading much of our empirical work. So thank you so much. We are excited to be here. We are poised for growth and eager to collaborate. So we can't wait for what comes next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. There is room for a quick question.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your presentation. I found it really stimulating. I wanted to ask something more about the toolkit for Evaluate, because I'm really focusing on this measurement of the impact of cultural activities, and it's true that often it's concentrated on economic values. So I would love to know something more about what are you actually measuring and how. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. So we have batteries of questions that we have developed and validated with regard to these 5 mechanisms, the RAISE mechanisms. We also have developed other research instruments and are continuing to develop more. All of those are available on our website. So I would say the first step would be humanitiesandhumanflourishing.org, and then don't hesitate to reach out if you have further questions about them or about their implementation. Again, our goal here is to do the research and then put it out into the world for it to be freely accessible and hopefully greatly used. So we welcome your collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question for James.
Yeah.
Just on the topic of measures, I wondered if creative self-efficacy was a scale that showed up at all in the toolkit. This capacity to be able to respond with novel or hoping. I could see an interesting space for that particular measure?
Yeah, so in that toolkit itself, those we created specifically for these mechanisms, tooled specifically for them. So not in that toolkit. However, for other measures that we've created on self-efficacy, and so what we do is a literature review first to see what kinds of measures, because there are a lot of great measures like the one you mentioned, right? And so incorporating them. So what we need, I think, moving forward is not only our team's work, but everyone's work to make these measures salient and easily available, so that when people are, doing research or they're out in the field with any number of cultural organizations, things like creative self-efficacy and any number of other measures can be readily available and as easy to use as some of the economic measures that are more frequently used now. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Next speaker is Nisha Sajnani, New York University. Nisha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And all right, so thank you so much, as others have said, for the invitation to join you today. It's such a pleasure to be here at this table, at the table that we're co-creating together. I just really appreciate that metaphor, and it really picks up on another body of research that I won't be speaking about today, but that's on rasa aesthetics, which draws from Indian performance theory, rasa really meaning flavor or savor, which is a different way of thinking about the aesthetic experience. And on one side, it relates to ingestion and imbibing and taking in, and there's a downside to that. But it also means sitting around and feasting together, and digestion as an interesting corollary for aesthetic engagement. So really appreciate it on that level. And another one that I'm going to share maybe towards the end. So when Pierluigi invited me to be a part of this conversation, we had started talking about measures and approaches to evaluation. So I was thinking a little bit about that in shaping this talk. But then after being with all of you yesterday, there were so many wonderful things that were discussed that I sort of reframed what I wanted to share. And I'm going to orient it around three particular points of conversation that arose yesterday as points of departure. But first, I've put up this website, which is a temporary website. I know Niels referenced the Jamil Arts and Health Lab yesterday, which is a lab that we have at New York University, established in collaboration with the WHO to contribute to this table that we are building together with you. And I would say the four main goals of this lab, just so that you have a bit more of an orientation to it, because I think we really are invested in thinking together about how we contribute to one another in this space. So I'm opening up that question for us to think about together with you. But these four main areas are identifying and coordinating efforts where possible between research centers focused on the health benefits of the arts and culture in order to, as I believe Joanna actually mentioned yesterday, avoid comparing apples with pineapples, but also to support joint efforts at funding, to scale promising interventions, especially those that engage and reflect the concerns of underrepresented communities. James mentioned that briefly as well. Another goal would be to translate the findings that we have together from our network into policy recommendations and opportunities for implementation, whether that be through social prescribing or other means. So I found it quite hopeful that new communication that Lars mentioned yesterday from the EU Commission on mental health included statements about the importance of cultural prescription, for example. Another goal would be to convene and collaborate on opportunities for public engagement, such as this one, and by supporting capacity building in the area of research and evaluation, which James also touched on. And we do that through this network of research centers that we've been collaborating with. So listening to the conversation yesterday, there are three moments that really stood out to me as opportunities to think about research and evaluation, to think about how we are contributing to this space. The first moment at the end of our day yesterday was one where I believe Nico on the last panel had reflected the many ways in which culture was being discussed. It was being mentioned as historical artifact, collective practice, human experience in relation to what holds meaning. We heard culture referenced in terms of cultural democracy, the democratization of culture, and a partner in the process of decolonization. So my first comment is about just recognizing, on one hand, the complexity of culture as conceptually difficult to define, and The need, of course, on the other hand, for operationalized terms in order to advance inquiry. And this tension has been present in all of our conversations in the lab, but we do have some work to build on if we choose to. So the definition of arts and health as developed in the 2019 WHO report that Niels referenced yesterday on the role of the arts in improving health and well-being began with this acknowledgement of this complexity, but also a recognition that art forms share certain cross-cutting characteristics. So for example, maybe we'll just, we can take down the website because I imagine watching it go on repeat 6 times might be nauseating. Maybe we could just, okay, all right. All right, here we go. So for example, there was a collective recognition that the arts are considered intrinsically valuable and provide imaginative and emotional experiences. That's okay. We don't need to scroll up to the whole thing. But that's a nice picture. That's all right. So there's this collective recognition that the arts are considered intrinsically valuable and provide imaginative and emotional experiences. And furthermore, the WHO definition is founded on this understanding of health as connected to social and cultural contexts, which draws and builds upon that 1948 definition of health as a state of physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And James and I have been having an interesting conversation about how flourishing is related to that, to the aspiration behind that definition. And so within this frame of reference, numerous kinds of activities that are considered arts activities may intersect with health and well-being, including active and receptive participation in performing arts activities such as singing and dancing and acting, visual arts participation including drawing and painting and craft, digital arts activities including photography, animation, filmmaking, literary arts such as reading, creative writing, and so on, cultural engagement such as going to museums, galleries, concerts, heritage engagement. So the second moment that stood out to me yesterday had to do with comments about hierarchies of evidence and the danger of the single story, which we were talking a little bit about in the days leading up to our time together here, which is the name of a talk given by Chimamanda Adichie, a Nigerian feminist scholar. So these hierarchies of evidence that may overly rely on evidence syntheses that draw on poorly designed studies, or, as someone in the audience put yesterday, restrict researchers to this Aristotelian hero's journey in which the researcher, our protagonist, sets out on an adventure, faces great challenges, conquers some to return with a little treasure, humbly shares their limitations and perhaps even their doubts, and requests resources for the next and necessary adventure. And we hear that story again and again. We must ask ourselves, is it time to break up with Aristotle? Is there some other way of telling stories? So with regard to evidence hierarchies, I was also reminded of the Romanian-American psychiatrist and theater artist Jacob Levi-Moreno, who introduced his world to psychodrama and sociodrama on April Fool's Day in 1921 in Vienna. So on that date, he staged a drama without actors at the Viennese Comedy House, proposing that the spectators themselves were actors and directors of the presentation. And this idea was also, of course, popularized and extended by inviting spectators to become spectactors by Augusto Boal in Brazil in his Theater of the Oppressed. But I was thinking about Moreno in connection to his writing on the Theater of Spontaneity, which he published in 1924, in which he laid out his views on the relationship between culture and creativity. And in Moreno's theory, creativity is often contrasted with what he called the cultural conserve, which he saw not only as cultural heritage or patrimony, which he regarded as an irreplaceable source of stimulus for innovation, but rather as a ballast forced upon the human mind by conservative social customs in relationships of power and financial interests. So I wonder about, and I found myself wondering about our own cultural conserve as we sat in this room, this way of delivering knowledge, for example, our ways of doing, our ways of being, our own cultural conserve as people invested in developing and acting upon the evidence of the health benefits of the arts and culture, and the ways in which we may gatekeep, and I may inadvertently gatekeep my own doctoral students and contributors to the journal that I edit, for example, from the full potential of our imaginative faculties in research, from our full flourishing. From the conversations yesterday, and in referencing the 2019 report once more, it is clear that our evidence reflects great methodological diversity, including narrative reviews, meta-analyses, control trials, cohort studies, qualitative case examples, and so on. And of course, while we can strengthen any one of these approaches, we need multiple ways of knowing, we know that reflect the values and purpose of the inquiry, and that multiple perspectives, mixed methods are necessary. But it's also clear that the measures we use should also reflect not only a deficit approach in which we seek to understand how cultural initiatives might reduce illness, but as somebody in the audience said somewhere in this corner yesterday, measures that permit us to better understand the contribution to culture, of culture to health promotion. And I think that you're very much on this, obviously, having developed so much work in this area. Connected to this, the third moment from yesterday that I want to reflect on had to do with the mention of artistic research, which came up a couple of times, which is the use of the arts in any phase of the research process, from data generation or collection to analysis and dissemination or communication. So, for example, I used to work in Orvieto, which is about an hour north of Rome. Some of you know it very well. If you haven't gone, please go visit. It is such a beautiful town. I used to work with the Harvard program in refugee trauma there pre-COVID, and then we moved our programs online. And every year, 70 people who worked in the humanitarian sector would gather to resource themselves by basking in beauty and eating good food and having cappuccinos readily available, resource themselves and reflect on mental health in the context of global health. And every year, I would ask them to bring a photograph of what constituted a healing environment for them. What contributed to healing? Can you show me in a photograph? This simple photo voice project over 10 years began to reveal certain themes, namely that the majority of photographs reflected nature, followed by people around meals, followed by people engaged in different communities of practice, be they spiritual, cultural, or athletic practices. So here, photography was being used as a language, a participatory approach to giving voice to each person's experience. And had we the time, we could have also engaged in a collaborative approach to analyzing those images. In this case, I did that together with a colleague. We noticed those themes and then shared these in a public exhibition in person and online, in a way that I know my mother could enjoy, because my mother, despite her every wish to participate in the academy, was held back for many different reasons at that time, growing up as a woman in Malaysia. But I was thinking about what would engage my mom in this process of knowledge creation. And I do often keep her in mind and communities that I belong to in mind. We had a conversation about this too, James, actually, come to think about it. Yeah, all right. So I actually, I teach this course on arts-based research for our doctoral students at NYU Steinhardt each year. And in fact, the next version of that course begins tomorrow online, which is terrible planning on my part. But usually I'm faced with this statement, yes, but is it research? They're inspired by the idea, but there's this cultural conserve that's sitting there. Yes, but is it research? Can we let ourselves lean into this? So I usually find myself sharing this story. And it's a story about, am I still okay on time? Yeah. Okay. It's a story called Beatrice and Virgil, Beatrice and Virgilio, and it's not Dante's story, but rather Jan Martel's 2010 novel of that title, Canadian writer Jan Martel, best known perhaps for Life of Pi. And it begins with our protagonist, Henry, who's this successful writer attempting to publish his latest book, which is made up of a novel and an essay. And Henry plans for it to be a flip book, so that the reader can start at either end reading the novel or the essay first, because both pieces are equally concerned with representations of the Holocaust. On one side, the essay lays out the facts and figures of the Holocaust, and in the novel, it is a work of fiction. So imagine that you have the book in your hand, piled in your stack of resources that you intend to go through as part of your studies into genocide, and you sit down and you pick up the book. Which side of the book do you begin with? Just notice for yourself. Which side of the book do you begin with? And the question, of course, opens up a space to consider how we relate to knowledge, especially those cultural conserves, those established canons, but also an invitation to consider fiction, the counterfactual, as a pathway to the permeable, to discovery. And so I had an ending that wrapped this up in the way that I've been trained, in a way that weaves together the points, in a way that would respect the cultural conserve. But I'm going to go off script a little bit and invite you into a little spontaneity, if you don't mind, if I have a couple of minutes. Okay, so then I'm going to ask for that other slide. And all of the Italians in the room, I'm going to ask for your help, okay? Because we've been talking about tables. Those of you who speak Italian, if you don't, you're going to practice it now. All right, we've been talking about tables, and we've been talking about co-constructing a table. And we've been talking about the role of beauty, the role of culture, the role of the arts in that. And the best song I know comes from this site on Italian heritage, this invisible cultural heritage. And I know I'm going to totally butcher the pronunciation, but ho bisogno praticare, and I'm going to try. All right? So we're going to sing it with the Italians first, starting with the line, per fare un tavolo ci vuole legno. Legno? Legno?
Legno.
Legno. See, thank you. This is why I need you. So we're just going to sing that second stanza, per fare un tavolo ci vuole legno, just that stanza together and once, and then we're going to repeat it. All right? And you have the English translation. Can we go to the English translation for a moment? If you don't have it, I'm just going to give you the English translation. It says, to make a table, you need wood. To make the wood, you need a tree. To make the tree, you need a seed. To make the seed, you need a fruit. To make the fruit, you need a flower. You need a flower. You need a flower. To make a table, you need a flower. To make a table, you need a flower. All right? All together now. Per fare un tavolo ci vuole il legno. Per fare il legno ci vuole l'albero. Per fare l'albero ci vuole il seme. Per fare il seme ci vuole il frutto, per fare il frutto ci vuole il fiore, ci vuole un fiore, ci vuole un fiore, per fare un tavolo ci vuole un fiore. One more time. Everybody now. Put that up. Grazie.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Any question? There is room for a question or for another song if you want. It's a very Italian traditional one, so if you have a traditional song from your country, you can share with us. Or we can share at the coffee break.
I have a comment. That was marvelous, both the essay and the fiction. But the experience of singing together put all of us in a dramatically different place, right? And I just think that experience of singing together is so much about what this meeting is about. And so thank you for bringing the actual experience of the arts into our very academic kind of talking about them. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. Karaoke tonight, maybe?
Karaoke for cancer. That's what we were talking about yesterday, or karaoke for COVID. Yes, true.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nisha. So we can move to the next speaker. Sjoerd Ebisch, University of Chieti-Pescara. And since we have a challenge in my talk, I will use my guitar, so be ready to... No, just kidding. Please, Sjoerd.
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me this wonderful workshop to present some of our work we are doing, and I try to connect it somehow also to the context of this workshop. I'm Sjoerd Ebisch. I'm a local speaker, actually. I'm working next door at ETAP at the Department of Neuroscience. And today I will speak about the sense of self, integrating psychological neuroscientific perspectives. I'm a psychologist, so I'm mainly interested in investigating, studying psychological mechanisms to explain certain relationships and psychological mechanisms that can explain, that can be mediators, for example, to explain certain relationships, like, it's down below for the audience maybe. to put it more in the context of this workshop and in the context of art and culture, I think that the sense of self is actually is a crucial concept actually can be conceived as a mediating psychological mechanism that can explain actually the impact that art and culture can have on mental health and social cohesion, for example. Well, I will show some empirical work we are doing now. Also, we will use this experiment also to explain what we mean with the sense of self and how we can study this at a scientific empirical level. So, well, we conceive the sense of self as a multidimensional construct. It is composed of two main components. We have like an intrinsic sense of self, which is more related to self-referential processing, autobiographical memory, to perceive the perception of a stable sense of self over time, also projections of the self in the future. And on the other hand, we have also an extrinsic sense of self, which concerns more the relationship of the self in interaction with the environment. Here we have a very important concept of the sense of agency, which also to return in the work of Doris Sommer, cultural agents maybe, which is concerned actually here in this context the control we perceive over our actions, over our thoughts, the control we receive over events in our environment. And well, I think that actually the sense of self is actually emerges from a combination of these interaction between the various aspects of the sense of self. Okay, to make it even more concrete, we designed an experiment that we used in the fMRI scanner to study, for example, brain mechanisms that are involved that support actually the sense of self and what is actually the nature and the structure of the sense of self. So we presented for a linguistic experiment because well, usually in empirical research we are constrained to simplify things and find creative ways to do that, to study it empirically. We presented the syllables to the participants while they were in the scanner. And then they had to make a choice because the syllables could form two words, motor, motorcycle, or house. Then they selected one of the two words. And then there was an auditory feedback. And then this feedback actually defined the experimental conditions which were modulating the sense of self of the participants. So we modulated the sense of identity, for example, in this way, in the self-identity condition. The participants then heard their own the word in their own voice, which was recorded before. And in the other identity condition, the participant heard, for example, the voice of an unknown person. And then agency, we modulated by, in the self-agency condition, feedback was always, almost always, the word that was selected by the participants, so they perceived a sense of control over what they are doing and the feedback they received. And in the other agency, the feedback was just completely random, so they didn't perceive any control over the consequences of what they were doing. Okay. Well, then what we are specialized in doing actually in this moment is studying brain networks. We're not looking at just brain activation. I think that's not the way the brain works. The brain is actually a network which reorganizes dynamically according to conditions and context. Well, we use this and graph theory measures to study integration and segregation processes of brain networks, how they dynamically change. Well, so just some can get out of this is well, we show in these different experimental conditions. We can show actually the brain architecture, the functional brain architecture of the brain, which is then organized in several sub-networks. But we see that these can change actually according to the condition. What we found is actually that this was intriguing, that when self-reference, self-relatedness was completely absent, some specific networks actually fell apart. They disintegrated into several parts. So it was like, and it was happened actually when in this condition, other agency, other identity. So when the stimulus was not myself, so the participant was thinking, okay, this is not me. So what then happens, for example, the brain actually fragmented in some way in some certain networks. For the neuroscientist in the audience, it was we had the default mode network, which is related also to more intrinsic self-processing, also mind wandering and this kind of processes. And we have also the frontoparietal network, which is more a sensory motor network related to extrinsic processing. Neuroscientific details. But then we also we use some psychometric measurements to explain some individual differences because it's not the same for all the participants, of course, what happens. There's a huge individual variability always in these studies. Well, yeah, we use some sophisticated psychometric methods here to show this, and I'm not going into much detail here. Well, one factor was mostly important. We found one personality trait factor, which was psychosis-like experiences. These were just healthy subjects. It was not, they were not psychiatric patients. Then we found actually that there was also, well, we focused on participation coefficients. What is this? It's actually a measure is how much certain brain regions, which are located in certain brain networks, how much they communicate with brain regions which are located in other networks. So this is a measure of brain integration. So we find actually that in conditions that but the brain was more, these certain brain networks were actually more isolated from the rest of the brain when people had more psychosis-like experiences in everyday life. So this is it's interesting because they're healthy subjects. Also interesting was that it happened in ambiguous conditions. So when there was a conflict between agency and identity. Okay, so this, I think these kind of things could also represent some kinds of vulnerability factors, which is important at the level of prevention. So, for example, some personality traits, for example, are risk factors to lose a sense of self, for example, or also ambiguous conditions at the level of the self can produce risk factors for which are relevant also for mental health, for example. Some other things we are doing, well, we are doing the same studies now also in psychiatric populations like schizophrenia, which is still in running this project. We are just including now patients and very curious to see what happens in schizophrenic patients. I'm not going to show this now because that's so much time. Other things we are doing, of course, is, well, as I said before, as psychologists we are trying to find ways of measurement. We are also working on psychometric levels. So we, for example, we try to develop psychometric scales to measure individual differences in certain concepts. Here, for example, well, we recently did. We developed a psychometric scale to measure the sense of self, and this in the similar context, composed of similar components in sense of self, in terms of sense of identity and sense of agency. Which is something new we did is actually we built then two versions actually of this psychometric scale. A trait version and a state version, which is not very common actually, but I think it's very important because in many studies psychometric scales are used, but often they use it in a trait way instead of a state way, because traits are in the state version it actually measures how people are experiencing themselves usually. Well, state version of the scale actually measures how a person feels or experiences himself or herself in the specific moment. This could be more important actually to when we want to measure if contexts or certain conditions or certain interventions have an impact on the sense of self. Okay, so why we do this? Well, we got a long list of items. Here's an example. So I have the sensation that emotions that I feel, experience are not real, and then the participants respond on a scale from completely disagree to this to completely agree. Well, we had many items. What came out of it is we had two versions then of this scale. As you can see here, maybe make it, there's also the English translation. It was developed in Italian. So here we have the items that were included in the scale to measure actually concretely the sense of self. We found three factors: the sense of identity. You will see the examples of items that measure the identity. Here, state of sense of agency, for example, with the examples. What was so surprising was that we found actually a third factor, which has to do with technology, which were actually sense of agency items. But they had to do, they concern specifically interactions with technology. And so analysis just put us into the reality, and they said it was something completely different, which is also surprising, but also interesting, I think, in the future if we want to study interactions with technology. Well, in the trade version, actually we found only one factor where identity and agency measures were mixed up in a single factor, just which makes also sense, I think, because it was a bit ambiguous, actually. Because well, the model that best described was actually these items was more that showed that there's always a general factor present. So also if there are single sub-factors, aspects of the self, there was always a general factor that explained variance in all the items together, which may represent actually a more general sense of self, independent of features of the sense of self you can see here. Well, there are some. I think we have some correlations here that show that maybe that some interesting future applications of these scales. Well, it was very strongly related to psychotic-like experiences in healthy people. Also with hopelessness, which is important, for example, for depression and suicide risk. Also very strongly correlated with anxiety. In other contexts, we found also very important correlations with the general health questionnaire. So there's a clear relationship, actually, between the sense of self and general health of people. Even it was predicted somehow somewhat university performance in students. It was also related to perceived restorativeness of environments, big five personality traits, and stress induced by information technology. Okay, then to conclude, so what is next? Actually, what we want to do is so to study what is the impact of the context on the sense of self. We can think of various contexts: environmental context, technology, artificial intelligence, social context, architecture, cultural, educational context. Then one main question is, has the sense of self a mediating role in the interaction between context and mental health? Well, actually, now we have a national grant, actually, where we are looking at this in another way. We are looking at how interactions with nature actually improve mental health, especially stress, and how this is mediated by the sense of self. I think a similar idea could be applied in the context of culture and art. And then also, what is the role of the sense of self for the social self and social cohesion? Actually, this reminded me that a few years ago I we wrote actually a huge research project on this in a social political context to show to study how sense of self in terms of agency and identity at individual and collective level contribute to social cohesion in European Union. It was not financed, unfortunately, so that was why I didn't remember it actually, but now. But maybe we can recycle some of this project. I think it would be very interesting. So this was briefly just what we are doing in our laboratory. So thank you very much for your attention, and if you have questions.
Thank you very much, Sjoerd. Yeah.
So I think, Sjoerd, really interesting. I think that one of the most interesting fields of study in this regard are really rituals, because rituals are very much about creating identity fusion. This is really recorded in so many different anthropological accounts. And it would be particularly interesting to understand, because, for example, when you spoke about quasi-psychotic experiences, this is what happens actually in many rituals. So from this point of view, it would be extremely interesting to understand, for example, how to track the evolution of the sense of self in this particular condition. Also because, of course, many cultural experiences of today are in some sense a devolution or, let's say, the contamination of different ritualistic practices. So I think that in particular for the focus of this conference and for the new center, this would be an extremely promising line for future research.
Okay,
thanks for a really interesting presentation. I'm wondering how stable this construct is of the sense of self, also between cultures and specifically between languages, where particularly where there are languages that perhaps don't emphasize personal pronouns in the same way that Anglo-Saxon or Latin languages do.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There's two levels. I think there's a linguistic level and a cultural level, maybe on this. How also the sense of self is changes the conception of the self. Maybe some aspects of the self maybe have more or less importance in different cultures. Also, yeah, already translating it from Italian in English was sometimes a bit complicated, so it didn't fit actually precisely sometimes, indeed. But yes, for now we just we validated in Italian, so it would be good and indeed very important, interesting if there are opportunities to translate the scale and then also validated in different countries and different cultures, actually see what happens. Also because we have the state versions, we also can then maybe look at how certain contexts modulate, change the sense of self, maybe in different conditions or situations in different cultures, different countries. Yeah.
Yeah, I also think that it could also depend on the role that a specific culture attached to the individual self versus the collective self. So maybe it's also a matter of individualistic versus collectivistic cultures. Over and above, of course, the role of pronouns in the linguistic tools that we use. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, here we're looking at a very individual sense of self, also very basic, actually. Interesting also to put it on a collective level as we did in the project. But yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Now it's the turn of Vittorio Gallese, University of Parma.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Pierluigi and all the organizers. In a way, this meeting is a dream coming true. I've been struggling with the attempt to build bridges between cognitive neuroscience and the humanities in the last 20 years or so. And let me advertise this logo, Neuroscience and the Humanities, is a lab I established together with a colleague, Michele Guerra, who's a film theorist in my university. If you Google that, you'll find a Facebook page and a YouTube channel where we upload the webinars that we have been organizing during the last 3 years or so on a variety of topics. The last 2 series of webinars were on the relationship between the body, the brain, and music. And another successful series was on the relationship between the brain, the body, and performing arts. So what I would like to do today is to talk a little bit about the possibility to look at cultural practices from an embodiment perspective. One of the distinctive features of our species is not to be happy with just one reality, the physical world. And since we have an historical record, but we keep predating the origin of what you see in this slide, we have been inventing parallel worlds. Worlds of beautiful animals painted in the caves in the Paleolithic, chimeric creatures, probably with the first major step forward in technological advancement, namely the invention of fire. Very soon people started sitting around the fire, telling stories. So we have been doing that orally for the vast majority of the history of our species. Then we invented writing, and then with an incredibly accelerating pace, a variety of other dispositive like photography, cinema, television, the smartphone, the metaverse, and who knows what's coming next. So the experience of cultural artifacts, this is the proposal for a reductionist like me. I'm a methodological reductionist, which means that I try to start from the complexity of the human condition and unpack it in a limited number of variables, because in the end we need to show digit figures, significant differences, and the like. But I would never think that the complexity of the human condition can be ontologically reduced. So I'm totally unhappy with colleagues of ours that produce books with very assertive title like Synaptic Man or stuff like that. So science, in particular neuroscience, offers a further perspective, a further level of description, which I think in the end can enrich our understanding of how we function in the world, but definitely is not capable to reduce at the level of the neurons the psychological and personal level of description. I mean, neurons don't dream, don't think, don't create. They don't do anything but emitting action potentials, okay? So the experience of cultural artifacts can be decomposed into its bodily and neurobiological grounding, and because cultural artifacts and the consequent social practices they determine emerge from implicit knowledge. The complex set of behavioral paradigms that individuals perform, simulate, and internalize mimetically due to the constant interpersonal relationship that occurs within specific environments. When I refer to aesthetic, I start with the etymology of the word, aesthesis, which means knowing the world by means of the senses, okay? So the aesthetic experience of cultural artifacts, pardon me the kind of mechanistic but bullet-like definition, but in 15 minutes I couldn't do more than that. So first, I think the aesthetic experience of cultural artifacts can be framed within the broader notion of intersubjectivity. I think the social dimension is the only dimension that we can employ to define human beings, as they are mediators of the relationship between the subjectivities of creators and the subjectivities of beholders. Second, vision is a process far more complex than the mere activation of the visual brain. We are synesthetes, and the brain follows. I mean, or if you prefer, to put yourself in a more mechanistic and deterministic point of view, just because the brain is synesthetic, we are a synesthetic creature. Our visual experience of the world, of the mundane world, but also of the parallel worlds I was mentioning before, is the outcome of multimodal integration processes in which the motor system is one of the key players. I declare it in the open, I'm a motor chauvinist. To me, thought is action. Last but not least, the multimodal integration of what we perceive is triggered by the potentiality for action that we express corporeally, what Merleau-Ponty defined as practognosia. Okay, this is the object of our investigation, although I must warn you, I don't subscribe to the view that the mind is in the head. At the very least, the mind is in the body, of which the brain is a part, a relevant part, a necessary but not sufficient part. The intercorporeal side of intersubjectivity, this notion is the outcome of our discovery of mirror neuron that for the first time revealed a mechanism, a neurophysiological mechanism that connects what we do with what we see others doing. So here you see a neuron that fires every time the macaque grasps a manipulable object, but the very same neuron also responds vigorously when the monkey is still looking at someone else performing the very same action. And what is interesting for the debate on digital dispositives, this is an experiment done by our colleagues in Tübingen University showing that the vast majority of this neuron not only respond to the observed action when performed by a physically present agent, but also when looking at the bidimensional screen where the action is presented as a film, which means that the evolutionary relevance of a mechanism that enables you to directly map what the other is doing is so powerful that can be translated also through a media to which monkeys normally in their natural environment have no acquaintance with, since they don't watch TV in the jungle, most likely. Right. And we recently published a paper trying to recap what has been found in the last 30 years since our discovery. And as you can see, this mechanism is evolutionarily speaking pretty old because it turns out to be present in bats, in birds, in rodents, in macaques, and most interestingly, in humans. And the most evolutionarily shared and original function of mirror circuit most likely is to enable the readout of social interactions, promote vicarious learning, and facilitate the planning of behavioral responses to others. We do have this mechanism as well with further qualification. Most likely we are the true mimetic species because this mechanism, which in macaques, as far as we understand, is confined to the performance and observation of goal-directed action, in our brain is active also by gratuitous movement like raising your arm, jumping, and dancing, or whatever. So, squeezed in a nutshell, the same cortical sites are activated during the execution, during the observation, during the imagination of object-directed action, communicative action, and bodily movements. But there's more. This is a tip of an iceberg. In 2000, with the philosopher Alvin Goldman, we went out on a limb. We hypothesized that mirroring mechanisms for action could be just the tip of an iceberg, a much bigger iceberg, and hypothesizing that similar mechanisms could be present in our brain also for emotions and sensations. And this hypothesis turned out to be true because it was empirically validated both in the domain of emotions and sensation. Just to give you an example, this is a parasagittal view of the human brain. This deep structure is the insula of Ryle, who takes the name from a famous doctor who diagnosed kidney stone to Goethe, but now is most famous because he gave his name to this very important part of our brain that most likely is a certain or connecting device between what's going on outside and what's going on inside of our body, matching exteroception with interoception. When you feel disgust because you are inhaling a disgusting odorant, as our poor volunteers in the scanner, you activate the anterior part of the insula, which also turns out to be activated when you witness the disgusted facial expression of someone else. Or in the domain of touch, one of the areas which belong to the network mapping somatosensory sensation on our body, which is activated when your body is touched, turns out to be activated also when you see the body of someone else being touched. And the same occurs with pain. So I came up with a model, embodied simulation, trying to provide a coherent and unitary framework that could explain, in a way from a functional point of view, all this disparate set of empirical evidence. So the functional architecture of embodied simulation in my hands is a basic feature of our brain, which makes possible our rich and diversified experience of space, objects, and of other individuals, being at the basis of our capacity to empathize, feeling in, einfühlen, with others. Sensory, motor, and affective bodily states and their underpinning neural mechanisms not only provide the architecture enabling to live in the world, so to speak, but also to inhabit those parallel worlds of cultural artifacts, like when beholding visual art, watching a movie, reading a novel. And we have been involved in empirical research in relation to our relationship with visual art, starting a collaboration in 2007 with David Friedberg at Columbia University. I'm just back from a sabbatical at the Italian Academy in New York. Unfortunately, we didn't know each other, otherwise we could have had a coffee somewhere in the village next time. We have done experiments in museums. We have done experiments in Castello di Rivoli with Caroline Bakargiev, comparing the behavioral response and the autonomic response to original artworks and the high-definition digital replica. We have been doing experiments in a movie theater in Mitte in Berlin to test to which extent the sharing of the experience of the filming experience would modulate again the autonomic response. I didn't have enough money to build wireless EEG, so the brain had to wait, but at least we got the data about the autonomic responses. So embodied simulation by means, this is a crucial aspect of the way our brain works, neural reuse, which means that part of the brain that evolved to match evolutionary pressure, when this evolutionary pressure changes and pushes towards the development of new cognitive skill, well, the very same areas learn to support this new cognitive function. We have not been designed at a table by some engineer, so when you read about the genetic mutation that turned a hairy individual into a speaking human, the FOXP2, the gene of syntax that Steven Pinker wrote in the past, I think that's all crap, to be quite outspoken. So by means of reuse, different brain regions enables the mapping of space, of objects, of action, emotion, and sensation in a very peculiar way from within. This is the ground level of intersubjectivity. It's not the only way. We can use language, we can use metacognition. I can reflect how appropriate is my judgment about a situation or another person, something that excites a lot of our colleagues, but they stop at the metacognitive level. Before and below that metacognitive level, we have the body, these parts of the brain, which enable us, so to speak, to acquire a more direct approach to the other, because we put into work our own system to map the other. But the other, on the other hand, shapes the way we react. So it's always a bidirectional relationship. So when navigating the parallel world of cultural artifacts, we basically rely on the same brain-body resources shaped by our relation to mundane reality. I never bought the idea of quasi-emotion. When I weep, which occurs recently pretty seldom, attending to a great performance of Traviata, let's say, my tears are not quasi-tears. I am genuinely moved, and what kicks in is the very same mechanism that normally would make me weep for a dramatic situation in my life or occurring to some people I care for. These resources provide a functional scaffold and the building blocks that our engagement with culture rearranges by means of different forms of framing. We are naturally technological human beings. This has been said many times, and it's a good antidote against the apocalyptic that every second day write article against, I don't know, streaming, ChatGPT. We have several intellectuals in Italy that every day say, oh, the good old times, praising airmails or stuff like that. So there is a direct connection between these two objects that you see projected on the brain. They are all part of our nature. So now we are dealing with the digital media sphere, and this elicits a set of questions that for the vast part are still waiting for an answer. What about if the cultural experience is digitally mediated, either by 2D screen or by the self-proclaimed more immersive virtual reality? How real is the digital world? We must understand how real the digital mediation of presence and social connectedness can be, because we must be ahead of the technological development. These are wonderful instruments that not only can turn ourselves into dumb, manipulated citizens, but that we can bottom-up creatively use to accomplish all the things that we have been discussing in the first part of the morning. What does it mean to share the experience of a cultural event with others? Is co-participation an added value? Is digital or virtual reality-mediated co-participation an added value? Most of these questions are waiting for an answer, and I think that this wonderful group can provide answer to that. To conclude, that the intercorporeality implied by embodied simulation constitutes a useful starting point to analyze the mode of presence that characterizes the digital mediascape, and to shed new light on our responses to cultural practices through its mediation. I think neuroscience can be valuable here because it can help us to deconstruct and understand the ways in which the body interfaces with the real world and with the digitized one. It can reveal some of the rules of the game, providing tools to design new contexts and new mediation. And this is it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Room for a quick question. Because we're a bit late.
Thank you so much. I'm very appreciative of this connections that you're making among the intersubjective levels that we can appreciate through neuroscience. What I would like to have you explore a bit more with us is how predictable and how stable this intercorporeality is. When I imagine a mirror response to someone else's feeling, am I slipping? Am I translating? When you say that language is one of the media that we can share, we know the promises and the dangers of language. how much danger is there, or promise? What I heard from you was more promise in the immediacy of the mirror neuron.
Yeah.
Because let me just continue, and you'll see where my worry comes from. One of the unfortunate responses that we're seeing in the United States now to language is the banning of books in several states in the United States, the banning of African American books. And I wonder if the rejection of those books has to do with the rejection of the immediacy, of the empathy that some racist readers cannot manage to feel with the response of African American readers and writers. In other words, is empathy a stable indicator of interpersonal relationships, or is there a built-in distance that we should be vigilant about? That's my question.
Yeah, very complex, and it will require a lot more time than I'm afraid I have. Well, first of all, let me say empathy is not a good or bad. It's one of the tools that we have at our disposal to relate with the other. The relationship is always reciprocal. The self is not a static entity. It's a word. These are all words, okay? And I reject the idea that our goal as neuroscientists should be to plant flags where we translate a concept like the self or beauty or the sublime or whatever with a bunch of neurons at a specific location in the brain. This is also important to clarify. So the self, at best, is a process. It's a dynamic process which is heavily influenced by your back history, by the context. If the mind is embeddedness means that you absorb like a sponge whatever is surrounding you. What you were asking, if I understood correctly, is to which extent this direct way to relate with the other can be somehow modulated by the use of words. Language only apparently refer to a different dimension with respect to the body, because language is embodied as well. When I read the description of an action, for example, or of an emotion or a sensation, even when I use the body at a metaphorical level, like when I produce the expression, "Oh, that man was oily," or "Oh, that job was pretty rough," it turns out that we activate the very part of the brain that activates when I appreciate the roughness or the slippery quality of a surface. Beside that, I would add that mirroring is a metaphor. We don't have mirrors in the brain. A mirror is a reflecting surface that only reflects what you put in front of it. If we want to stick with the metaphor of mirroring, we should add a very important qualification. We are metabolizing mirror. So there's always a component of projection so in that sense, if we are immersed in a language of a certain sort, which uses very particular way to designate minorities, this becomes internalized into our psychology and into our body. There are several examples that shows that if you embody yourself into someone with different bodily features, like the color of the skin, your ethno-racial stereotype can be greatly reduced. So you think that racism is an ideology. It is, but it is also a way of living with your body and within your body. So changing your bodily practices can affect also the so-called more abstract level that you employ in order to make sense of the social community you're immersed with. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I'm really sorry to stop this intriguing discussion, but we are late. Thank you very much, Vittorio. And now it's the turn of Leandro Valiati, please.
Thanks very much, Stefano. Can I talk from here? Yeah. Cool. Thanks. So, good morning. I have like the hard mission to talk just before the coffee break and after really, really lovely and interesting talks before myself. Thanks, Pierluigi. Thanks, Ricardo. It's really, really exciting being here, especially because I have to confess, I researched biobehavioral. I asked it to ChatGPT, what does it mean before being here? And basically to say that I'm an economist, I research and teach in an institute, in an interdisciplinary institute of cultural practices at the University of Manchester. And my interests of research basically are impact, measurement, and evidence for policies for creative cultural industries and arts. And it's just exciting to see that, thank you, that being here, and I feel like we are on the same page, which is like surprising, and this is a great example of a really, really nice interdisciplinarity. Well, I decided to make an approach today much more talking about a process of our research. I recently finished the first stage of this research, and to share with you how we are, me and my co-authors, we are building this interdisciplinary approach for producing evidence for policies in arts and culture, particularly regarding well-being, because you know, economics is also about well-being. And well-being, as we are definitely seeing here, you can have innumerable approaches for well-being. And in that particular case, I will tell a very brief story here. I will talk today about the project Building the Barricades, which is a large investigation at Favela da Maré, which is an area of intense social vulnerability in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. But how I got there at Favela da Maré, investigating arts, practices, and mental health. Everything started with a relatively small project. I got some funding from the UK Ecosystem of Research Funding to create a toolkit about the impact of 3 arts organizations. One in Manchester called Contact Theatre, another one called Battersea Arts Centre in London, and the third one is the Centre of Arts of Maré, which is like a very representative center of arts located at Favela da Maré in Rio de Janeiro. It was absolutely surprising to see that we basically created a toolkit composed by 25 indicators on basically well-being, empathy, capacity of trusting others. Anyway, a large toolkit of indicators, understanding some impact on young people after participating in the cultural activities in these 3 cultural centers. It was absolutely surprising that the young people from Favela da Maré, do you know, when I talk about favela, do you know the concept? Brilliant. The results of these indicators applied in young people at Favela da Maré were basically way better in terms of results compared with the young people in London and also in Manchester. Of course, we work in 3 areas of social vulnerability with particular differences. The social vulnerability in London is something, social vulnerability in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro is another completely different thing. And that rings a bell, like, okay, but what's different here? And me and my co-authors, Paul Heritage from arts, Stephen Prieb from psychiatry. At that moment, I was at Queen Mary University in London. And we decided to apply for a bigger research project aiming to produce a comprehensive mapping of cultural practices, episodes of violence, and also mental health at Favela da Maré. And so, now we are here building the barricades. And what's basically, what was our approach? Please, Francesca, could you just access this second link here? I'll get there later. So, we applied for this big funding where we get like funding to investigate statistically representative investigation, interviewing 1,200 adults, because was like very difficult to work with young people at that moment, and we applied we applied three instruments of research. The first of them was the BSI. We investigate like 53 items comprising 9 symptoms to compose a general symptom index, like depression, anxiety, paranoid ideation, psychoticism. Of course, I have a lovely, brilliant co-investigator from psychiatry being responsible for this exactly approach. Also, the second instrument was the Manchester Chart Assessment for Quality of Life, which is a very interesting index about subjective satisfaction, including financial elements, relationship with friends, family, physical health, emotional health. Is, of course, a very powerful instrument, and also the cultural practices profile. We did a very comprehensive cultural practices profile containing basically the traditional consumption on movies, theater, books, dancing, singing, playing, and so on. But we split it between digital and face-to-face or presential activities, indoors and outdoor. And it was like very challenging, but also, let's say that was a research opportunities that because COVID hit just during the first phase of the research. And we were like, with a research team composed by 20 investigators applying the research. It was a household survey. They knocked in each door at Favela da Maré. Considering our survey, it was not a census, but was just a survey. And we had to deal with COVID. And of course, luckily, we achieved to finish the field research, but we have now the capacity to compare before and after COVID. So, because we have the before. Anyway, so we built these profiles of mental health, quality of life, and cultural practices. And it's very powerful, the perception that how different cultural activities have a different perspective of impact regarding these elements of mental health and well-being. Basically, in a nutshell, if we aggregate the cultural consumption profile, we can see that individuals who have more cultural practices, they are scoring worse in terms of quality of life and better in terms of mental health. It's so impressive, but again, we need, I'm here basically also answering to the organizer's suggestion, what I think that was lovely, to talk about next steps. And the next steps in this investigation is fundamentally to understand better the relation between each artistic cultural activity and these two indexes of mental health and well-being, satisfaction of life. Anyway, so we, please, we can have the link? The PDF, please. Thanks, Francesca. So, we, at this stage, basically published this first report. I will make this available with every result we are now basically working with. And can we have the map? Because it's a technical thing. I can't just scroll around the report here. Otherwise, yes. So we will make this available. And just to give you a sense of what's the territory of Maré. Maré is basically, this is Rio de Janeiro. Let's say here is the soft power Rio de Janeiro. In the south zone of the city, like around here, Copacabana, Ipanema, and so on. And Maré is here. It's this big territory in the north zone of Rio de Janeiro. And there is some anecdotal element, but also important, is that there are 3 different territories in Maré, split by wars of power between drug gangs. And the only reason a person is allowed to cross the territories is, 1, to visit family, if they have family living in other parts of the territory, or to do cultural practices. And again, I'm just bringing here some anecdotal elements to share with you, like, how impressive was the process. I think that this is the typical research in which the process is as rich as the outcomes. To share with you, so we have this database. We published 2 papers so far, which fundamentally are very, very small and, let's say, narrow use of the database. Basically, we published the research protocol at Lancet, Regional Americas. And also, we decided to start publishing about the relation between urban violence and the choice of cultural participation. But now, as next steps, I'm fundamentally getting back to this database to understand particular correlations between each type of cultural consumption, violence, consumption of the territory, and these 2 indexes of mental health and well-being. Basically, I think that these are the main next steps now. And I'm, particularly me and one of my co-authors now, we are really reflecting in how to approach better this database, just because we have, like, in hands some very important evidence for policies, because this is a very violent and with high levels of social vulnerability territory, in which we can really have a great case study to produce some relevant knowledge on how policies for arts and culture can also look at these elements as a complex concept for well-being, and how we are reaching our desires as a society. And we are looking at now, this big investigation was funded by Economics and Social Sciences Research Council from the UK, and they have some now some call on secondary data, which means, like, get back to secondary data and trying to bring new evidences. And my even I'm open even to get more insights from here. I'm having a lot of insights in order to bring some collaboration for this new round of investigation in this database. And also, finally, the pandemic, the investigation on the before and after pandemic, it inspires me to get back to the territory and trying to, to have the comparative perspective, because I think that this is something that very insightful, but also it was something absolutely by chance. We decided to split our questionnaire on cultural practices inside the residences and outside the residences. And it was very helpful because we had lockdowns all around. And again, all this investigation was only possible because we had this partnership with the Center of Arts of Maré. And I think that this ecosystem of research between economists, psychiatrists, and also cultural practitioners, it's a very rich ecosystem in order to produce relevant interdisciplinary evidence, but also, of course, when we are working outside of our disciplinary, well-shaped, well-rounded field, we are much less subject to even to have some, good evaluation, good criticism, good feedbacks. And this is a challenge. This is difficult. But also, I think that otherwise it works to especially understanding the impact of arts and culture and how we can really offer new evidences. And I finally, just to finalize, I get back to the toolkit perspective. From an economic point of view, we have like powerful instruments, but limited when we are trying to grasp the very concept of well-being and the very capacity of making decisions as a society, looking at the impact of our decisions. And so basically, I would like to share this like interdisciplinary attempt of doing research on mental health, gathering economics, and in that particular case, well-being and mental health. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Leandro. Question for Leandro? Yeah.
I just wanted to thank you so much for this talk and wondered if the Musée de Marais was part of the landscape that you explored. I had the chance to visit it in March and just found it to be extraordinary. The first museum in a favela.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nisha. Lovely. You met Eliana, probably.
Si.
Yeah. So, yes, it's part of the ecosystem. And I forgot to say, sorry. The whole, one of the principles of this investigation is co-creation. And of course, it produced a lot of limitations, but we created altogether the questionnaires. We are active co-investigators. The managers of the museum, the people working at Favela, they are co-authors in our papers. And also the research team, for practical reasons, we worked with local young researchers that they live at Favela da Maré. So it was easier for many reasons, but also it was a way to empower these research groups.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was marvelous, Leandro. I agree. We're all on the same page here, which is really fun. I understand that you're continuing to look at the data, but I'm really curious to see if you have a hypothesis about this really interesting outcome that those who experienced more cultural activities had worse quality of life but better mental health. What do you make of that?
Yeah, good. Again, what's my hypothesis regarding this? Basically, is around awareness. Awareness. What I mean about this? Let's say people who are actively consuming culture in a broader spectrum in the favela, and there is a really, really rich scenario of cultural practices. Even, we don't have time for this, but we have to redefine some elements in the research because they really believe that some things that we don't think that our cultural practice are, even a bad thing. But we can get back on this at other point. But fundamentally, let's say, who are scoring better in a broad spectrum of cultural consumption. They have less like what we are calling mental health issues like depression, anxiety. But in other eyes, they have a worse score in assessment for quality of life because they are more aware about the conditions in which they are living with high levels of violence, with non-accessibility of like social benefits, with lack of state, and they are thinking, okay, they think better and more about their reality. So, of course, this is a very long discussion, but
Fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope you appreciate the session as I did. And so see you in a while after the coffee break.